In this video, we're going to cover basically a section at the end of chapter 4, section 7.4, that focuses on some of the things or some of the areas where GDP is not maybe the best measure, right? So overall, GDP does a pretty good job of measuring economic activity, but there's some things that it lacks, and we'll talk about this. Now, one of the biggest factors is that non-market production is not counted in GDP, right? So anything that is new production that happens outside what we call the formal economy. So the formal economy would be if you have a business, for example. But if you're making stuff at home and selling it on Etsy, right, it's new production, right? So new production is supposed to be counted in GDP. That's what we're trying to measure, but it wouldn't be. So, for example, if a parent decides to take home, if a parent decides to stay home and take care of their kids rather than work, right? So that's new production of child care services that's not counted in GDP, right? If a parent works and their child goes to daycare, then those daycare services are counted in GDP. So, right, you've got similar things happening. In one aspect, it's measured in GDP. In another aspect, it's not. Okay. So again, crafts, produce grown, sold, and farmers market, stuff like that, that's not counted. Okay. So, and again, this can complicate comparisons of GDP over time because, right, in the past, there was a lot more production that took place in the home, whether it was child care services or whether it was, farming or whatever it was. There was a lot more production that took place outside of the formal economy. So when you're comparing GDP today to, say, GDP 50 years ago, you're not quite comparing the same thing because there was a lot of stuff that went on 50 years ago that wasn't measured in GDP. So GDP long ago probably understates the true kind of production or level of production that took place in an economy. So here's some goofy examples of home-based production that aren't counted in GDP, all of which are fairly clever. The little kid in the lobster suit in the lobster pot, not bad. The little kid will work for candy, things like that. Right, this is creative work that's not counted in GDP. Now, there's also underground and black markets are not counted in GDP. Now, we would say maybe we don't want to count those things because, it's people doing bad, illegal things, okay? However, it is new production, right? And now that many states have actually legalized marijuana, either for recreational purposes or for medicinal uses, there is some production of marijuana that's now counted in GDP because marijuana is now part of the quote-unquote formal economy, right? That stuff would be measured now. But other illegal drug sales wouldn't be counted, or any other black market or illicit activities, right? Also, wages paid to undocumented workers or illegal immigrants, right? That's not counted, yet that's new production, right? They're doing work and they're providing services, and that wouldn't be counted in GDP, okay? So we know these markets aren't small, right? Some people could say, well, there's not that much of this, so it's, it doesn't matter. GDP is, the fact that it's not included in GDP is not that big of a deal. Well, it turns out actually these markets actually are sizable. And we largely know this because actually most currency in circulation, so U.S. bills, paper bills that are in circulation, aren't actually circulating through the formal U.S. economy, right? They're largely used in black markets or in other countries if that country has a currency that's, terrible. They'll just use the U.S. dollar. Sometimes they'll use the euro. They basically want to use any type of currency that is a good currency. And so, the U.S. dollar is largely used in black markets and in other countries. And so we know these markets are large because a lot of the money is circulating now. All right, now some other aspects that aren't counted in GDP that reflect quality of life would be things, like vacations. Well, I guess you would pay for a vacation, so that would be in GDP. But spending time with your family, for example, that wouldn't be counted in GDP. Okay. So GDP is not designed to be a measure of the quality of life. It's designed to be a measure of economic activity. However, it often is used as a measure of the quality of life. Okay, because people argue, well, if you got the money, then you can pay for the quality of life. And I mean, yes, to a point, right? So yes, you can pay for good health care. Yes, you can pay for nice vacations, but you know, maybe getting access to some types of food or spending time with family or, you know, kayaking on a river. I don't know. There's all kinds of aspects of quality of life that aren't really money. And so if you're thinking of GDP as a measure of well-being or quality of life, it's not going to be the greatest measure. Okay. So this is why, other wealthy countries like France, they prefer other measures of well-being. I mean, they're a high-income country. Their GDP per person or per capita might not be quite as high as the U.S., but they would argue that their quality of life is better over in France, right? They have more vacation days and they have better restaurants and so forth. So that part is obviously subjective, right? Americans and French, we could probably argue all day about who has the better quality of life. But there's going to be a lot of things that are non-monetary that matter for life that aren't counted in GDP. Now, what we just talked about was kind of non-monetary aspects of GDP and how that matters for well-being. What we're going to talk about now are things that, or is a topic that's not necessarily about non-monetary quality of life, but it has to do with the difficulty of trying to measure GDP in a very technologically changing world. Okay? GDP, and also when we're measuring inflation, oftentimes doesn't capture the quality of goods, right? So, for example, when we're measuring GDP or we're measuring the CPI, and say we're measuring the price or we're measuring production of a computer, right? Computers today are way better, light years better than computers 20 years ago. They can do way more stuff, for example. However, right, when you look at the measures of GDP, it's just listed as a computer, right? You're tracking the price of a computer, okay? So GDP is not very good at measuring changes in quality of things, okay? Right, a telephone 40 years ago was pretty rudimentary, whereas today our telephones, well, heck, our smartphones, we actually rarely use them as phones. They're largely texting and email and web surfing devices, right? So GDP can't really control for the changes in quality and the introduction of new goods, right? So as we're computing the CPI, as we're measuring the prices of goods over time, right? What goods are supposed to be in that basket the CPI is using to construct that index? Well, today it would be things like smartphones and iPads and, fancy running shoes. But 30 years ago, right, it would have had Walkmans and record players and things like that. So the basket of goods that we buy as consumers is always changing through time. So if you're trying to construct a basket and construct a price index to be able to compare it through time, this is going to be difficult to do because every 10 years or so, there's a completely new set of goods that need to be in that basket, right? And so that's why it's very difficult, and that's why here at the bottom it says, can we really compare life today to life in the 1950s? Yes and no. I mean, obviously there's things we can compare, but so much technologically is night and day different from what it was in the 1950s. So that complicates us comparing income and wealth and GDP through time. Okay. Now, in addition, there's a lot of things included in GDP that we might not want, right? So pollution. These are things we call economic bads. That is, things that are generated through new production that maybe reduce quality of life. And obviously pollution is a good factor here, right? So if we make paper and produce pollution, or if we generate energy and produce pollution, right now GDP is not adjusted for the pollution that's generated, right? So how would we adjust GDP for that? Would we somehow try to subtract it out? Would we adjust for it? Right? This really hasn't been settled, and so it's difficult to know how to deal with things that are economic bads, yet sometimes they're counted in GDP. Right? So again, these are kind of the errors and measurement issues with GDP. Okay. Now, going back to that idea of the difficulty of measuring GDP in the information age, or with new technology, the new technology has actually changed the productivity of the tasks we do, right? So, and what happens is this ends up understating our current well-being in today's information age, right? So a company might spend $1,000 on a computer. Well, that computer today can do way more than the computer could 20 years ago, right? But that difference in productivity is not going to be captured in GDP, right? And on the second bullet here, I've got cheap devices can now accomplish tasks that would have required extensive equipment 15 to 20 years ago, right? If you wanted to start a company 20 to 30 years ago, right, you needed to open up you needed to have office space, you had to have a bunch of equipment there and so forth. However, today, with telecommuting, right, this third bullet here addresses that, right? It's pretty easy to open up a business and, heck, run it from your dorm room. Probably some of you are doing that right now, right? So the information age, right, the technology we have today allows us to do a lot more with what we have. So therefore, if we think about GDP being a measure of well-being, and we're just measuring the dollar value of what we produce, there's so much more there that's not captured in it, because what I produce now using the equipment that I have now, I wouldn't have been able to do 20 to 30 years ago. Okay, so again, this is just an additional difficulty with GDP as a measure of well-being. Okay, and the last couple points here, the next point will be the broken window fallacy, which this slide kind of leads into it. But GDP can oftentimes be misleading, right? So if you look at GDP during World War II, the GDP of the US, the UK, Japan, Germany, it was increasing, right? Yet the quality of life during that period was not so good, right? Anytime we create military equipment, right, that's included in GDP. And during World War II, we were creating a lot of military equipment and we were blowing it up because we were trying to blow up somebody else's stuff, right? So GDP can be misleading, especially during wartime, right? A lot of people argue, man, you know, look at the GDP. World War II made a lot of people better off. I'm like, no, it's a lot of people who died in World War II. So, and usually death is a bad thing. Okay. So in that respect, GDP can be misleading because it includes new production, and that includes tanks and jeeps and missiles and planes and all that sort of stuff, which, right, you could argue is needed to sustain the peace and contributes to quality of life in that sense. True. But when it's actually used, it definitely destroys. Okay. Which leads us to kind of the last topic here, which is this idea of the broken window fallacy. And this is a fallacy that so many people fall into, okay? And it's the kind of the story of the seen and the unseen, okay? So oftentimes people will see economic prosperity in destruction and natural disaster and so forth, okay? So the story of the broken window fallacy is a little kid walking down the street one day, picks up a rock, and hucks it through the glass window of a bakery. Okay, And so everyone gets upset with the child because they threw a rock through the glass window, right? And then someone walks up and says, hey, actually, this child should be commended because now, right, this baker has to pay the glass repair person to fix the window, right? And that's additional income for the glass repair person. And that glass repair person can now use that money to say go buy a new suit or go buy some new clothing, and then that money becomes income for the other person as well. Okay, and so oftentimes when destruction occurs and people see, oh, well, look at the economic activity that comes about from the disaster, right? This was very common to see after the hurricane hit and kind of destroyed New Orleans. People were talking about, man, this thing of the economic prosperity that's going to come afterward. Well, yeah, but the city of New Orleans was leveled, right? And so the broken window fallacy brings up this idea of the seen and the unseen. When the kid breaks the window, what is seen is all the economic activity that takes place because of the destruction. Right? When that happens, people don't realize that actually there was kind of a whole other path we could have traveled if the kid hadn't broken the window. Because now that baker could have used that money to buy something else. Maybe that baker was planning to buy a suit or buy some new clothing, right? So that chain of events, that new income that's generated, would still be there if you don't break the window, right? So you have two paths. One path, you essentially have a broken window and then economic activity. And the other path, you have economic activity and no broken window, right? And so that's the idea of being careful of not seeing economic prosperity and destruction like wars and natural disasters. Right? Those things destroy. They make people less prosperous. Okay, so that's why the bullet down here. Right? If you follow that logic of wow, hurricanes and wars create economic prosperity, then you would just have lots of wars and then boost your GDP that way, and everyone would be better off. And we know that's just ridiculous, right? We can't destroy our way to prosperity. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, so that's it on this. That's a wrap on the issues and problems with GDP.